the Kerch Strait, where 30 or so journalists have been invited by the Crimea Bridge press service to see how the construction work is coming along.
The bridge is being built to schedule. As it stands today, 267 pillars have been put in place.
Russia are exchanging fire on multiple fronts. Bridges are being destroyed, cities are burning, and oil depots are under attack.
Years ago, the Russian Empire attempted the impossible. They built a bridge across the raging Yenisei River, one of the coldest, fastest, most unforgiving waterways on Earth. They called it the Krasnoyarsk Bridge. But this wasn't just steel and rivets. It was concrete, poured by the ton straight into the river's icy depths. Over a century later, bizarre events began near the old foundation. Locals reported tremors. Divers found twisted rebar. Now, engineers and historians are asking, what exactly led the Russians to make this decision?
They are building a 19-kilometer bridge with which the Russian government hopes to tie Crimea even closer to Russia, 2.5 years after Moscow annexed the territory from Ukraine.
Was the Krasnoyarsk Bridge ever just a bridge? Stick around because what we're about to reveal is sure to blow your mind. Russia's Krasnoyarsk Bridge. The Yenisei River, one of the longest and coldest arteries of Russia, has always been less of a river and more of a boundary. For centuries, it divided east from west, cities from settlements, the old world from the unknown. And then, in 1899, against all odds and logic, engineers bridged it with a structure that became the Krasnoyarsk Railway Bridge. But before we talk about the bridge, we need to first understand what exactly led to its construction. In 1891, Tsar Alexander III ordered the construction of a continuous rail line from Moscow to Vladivostok, believing it would tame Siberia, carry soldiers, coal, and mail, and turn scattered provinces into a unified state. But as the line crept eastward, one obstacle loomed larger than the rest: the Yenisei. It was too wide, too deep, and too wild. Bridges that tried to span such rivers in Europe bent or failed. The railway had to cross it, and it had to do so with certainty. The responsibility fell to Lavr Dmitrievich Proskuryakov, a civil engineer known for quiet brilliance and relentless precision. What he did was make things work, with math, grit, and a deep respect for physics. He understood that the bridge couldn't just hold trains. It had to survive the weight of locomotives, the pressure of ice jams, the threat of floods, and the bitter cold of Siberian winters. Construction began in 1896, and what followed was a feat of logistics and endurance. Steel components were fabricated in the Kolomna and Bryansk factories and transported thousands of mills across hostile terrain, by horse, by boat, and by rail where track existed. Workers labored in brutal cold, digging into frozen riverbeds, sinking foundations deep enough to anchor the bridge against shifting ice. Men even died, but slowly, one span at a time, the bridge took shape. By the time it was completed in 1899, the Krasnoyarsk Bridge stood as one of the most impressive steel truss bridges in the world. It was built of 6 symmetrical spans, each 472 feet long, resting on granite piers sunk into the riverbed. Its structure was entirely riveted, which was a technique that demanded intense accuracy. The girders were arranged in a through-truss design, allowing trains to pass inside the frame, protected from the elements and braced against lateral wind. What made the bridge unique was not just its scale or its symmetry, but the way it embodied Russian engineering at its finest. Proskuryakov's calculations were so precise that the design became a benchmark. In 1900, a model of the bridge was exhibited at the Exposition Universelle in Paris. This was the same World's Fair that had celebrated the Eiffel Tower just 11 years before. There, it won a gold medal. But awards and medals aside, the bridge's real value lay in what it did. With its completion, trains could now move unbroken from Europe into Asia. What had taken weeks now took days. Troops could be deployed, goods could be shipped, letters, people, and ideas began to move in ways they never had before. The Trans-Siberian Railway, and this bridge specifically, transformed Siberia from frozen wilderness into something functional and, in some places, flourishing. For decades, the Krasnoyarsk Bridge was more than a crossing. It was a lifeline. During the Russian Civil War, trains carried soldiers across it under fire.
It's been a century since the Russian Revolution and the formation of the world's first communist state.
In World War II, it bore the weight of endless supply trains heading east to escape the German advance. It was never rebuilt, never replaced. It didn't need to be. Its strength, both literal and symbolic, held firm. But time moved on. By the late 20th century, train traffic had grown heavier, faster, more demanding. New regulations and safety standards made the aging bridge less practical. As for Proskuryakov, he went on to become a professor at the Imperial Moscow Engineering School, training a generation of engineers who would design hundreds of bridges across the Russian Empire. But he never built anything quite like Krasnoyarsk again. In 1999, exactly 100 years after its debut, a new double-track bridge was built to the south. The original was retired, but not dismantled. In fact, one of its spans was preserved as a pedestrian walkway, a living relic where residents and visitors could walk under steel arches and feel the weight of history beneath their feet. Today, that single preserved span stands as a national cultural monument. In fact, it is a representation of Theopolitica impact the bridge had during the 19th century. But what was this impact exactly? Keep watching to find out. The political impact of the Krasnoyarsk Bridge. Most people don't usually think of bridges as political weapons. Roads and railways, maybe. But a bridge? It seems too practical and too inert to play such a role. And yet, in 1899, when the Krasnoyarsk Railway Bridge was completed across the Yenisei River, it didn't just change transportation, it altered the political chemistry of Russia in ways that would be sustained for generations. To understand the political weight of the bridge, we first have to grasp the world it entered. In the 1890s, the Russian Empire was massive. It spanned across 2 continents and 11 time zones, but it was not united. It was stitched together by loyalty to the Tsar, but geographically, it remained fractured. Siberia, especially, was its own world of snowbound exile, mineral wealth, and uneasy silence. It took months to cross from St. Petersburg to the Pacific by land, and in that slowness lay vulnerability. The empire could not defend itself quickly, could not move people or ideas effectively, and could not economically develop the large regions it nominally controlled. The answer came in the form of steel, the Trans-Siberian Railway. As was mentioned earlier, the railway, grand as it was, had a problem: rivers, and none were more politically symbolic than the Yenisei, a cold, violent ribbon of water slicing Siberia nearly in half. To cross it was to declare mastery over the continent. The Krasnoyarsk Bridge, then, was more than a structural necessity. It was an act of imperial consolidation. When the bridge opened in 1899, after 3 years of grueling construction,
completes the first bridge across the Yangtze, the formidable river that flows more than 3,000 miles across the middle of the country. The opening ceremony begins with traditional ribbon cutting.
Led by engineer Lavr Proskuryakov, it was the moment the Tsar's will met the wilderness and won. Politically, this mattered. Military units could now be dispatched in days rather than weeks. Supplies could flow, as could colonists, civil servants, and prisoners. Siberia was no longer peripheral, it was governable. In St. Petersburg, the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of War celebrated the opening as a turning point. One of the most immediate consequences was the acceleration of Russian colonization of Siberia. In the wake of the bridge's completion, government incentives flooded in: free land, tax exemptions, and promises of prosperity. Between 1900 and 1914, over 4 million peasants migrated east via the railway, many of them crossing the Yenisei over the new bridge. This migration changed the demographic and political character of Siberia. New towns emerged, old ones swelled. The state planted its flag in the form of schools, churches, police stations, and telegraph wires. And wherever the trains stopped, the Tsar's laws arrived too. But, as expected, imperial politics are never without friction. The railway and the bridge also made it easier to exile dissenters. Throughout the early 1900s, following the failed 1905 revolution, tens of thousands of political prisoners, socialists, anarchists, liberals were loaded onto trains and sent east. The Krasnoyarsk Bridge became, in a cruel irony, both a corridor of expansion and a pipeline of repression. It allowed the autocracy to project power even as its foundations began to tremble. By the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, the bridge had already become a strategic asset. When the Bolsheviks and their enemies began to tear the country apart in the civil war that followed, control of the Trans-Siberian line, and by extension the Krasnoyarsk crossing, became a matter of life and death. The White Army, operating in Siberia under the command of Admiral Kolchak, sought to control the railway to funnel troops and supplies. The Red Army, knowing the same, targeted railway hubs with obsessive precision. Once the Soviet Union was born, the bridge took on new meaning. Lenin may have preached the dictatorship of the proletariat, but he also understood logistics. The Bolsheviks inherited an empire in shambles and saw the railway as a lifeline. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, as Stalin industrialized and centralized power, the Krasnoyarsk Bridge carried grain quotas, workers, NKVD agents, and gulag-bound prisoners. It was used to build socialism and also to punish it. The region became dotted with labor camps, particularly in Krasnoyarsk Krai. Prisoners who once might have vanished into footmarch oblivion now arrived efficiently, by rail, under armed guard, their passage made possible by a bridge whose original purpose had been far more grand. The political impact deepened during World War II. As the German army approached Moscow in 1941, Stalin ordered entire factories to be dismantled and relocated east, beyond the Ural Mountains. Some went as far as Krasnoyarsk, where they were reassembled to continue war production. These emergency evacuations would have been impossible without the rail line and impossible without the bridge. Throughout the war, the Krasnoyarsk Bridge was crossed by trains hauling tanks, machine parts, and workers. It was never bombed, never sabotaged, never fell. Its survival was critical to the Soviet war effort and became a quiet symbol of endurance. After the war, the political meaning of the bridge shifted again. In the Cold War years, as the Soviet Union tried to project an image of strength and progress, infrastructure like the Krasnoyarsk Bridge became part of that visual vocabulary. Though never openly romanticized by the propaganda machine in the same way as Sputnik or the Moscow Metro, it was embedded in textbooks, technical manuals, and museum exhibits. It appeared in Soviet postage stamps and railway literature. And in local pride, too, Krasnoyarsk residents spoke of the bridge not as relic, but as proof that even Siberia could be modern, even central. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991,
Mikhail Gorbachev's dreams of holding the Soviet Union together may have received a death blow today.
the bridge was nearly a century old, but still functional. In fact, its enduring presence served as a metaphor in the years of post-Soviet uncertainty. And maybe more than anything, the political impact of the Krasnoyarsk Bridge lies in its invisibility. So much of modern politics is visible, such as flags, parades, speeches, ceremonies. As political systems crumbled and new ones were assembled, as leaders fell and economies unraveled, the bridge remained. And even today, the bridge is still relevant in today's architectural world. Stay tuned to find out how. The Krasnoyarsk Bridge's relevance in today's architectural world. In an age where architecture is often defined by spectacle in the form of gravity-defying skyscrapers in Dubai, kinetic facades in Beijing, and digital renderings more vivid than reality, it might seem strange to look for inspiration in a single-span bridge built over a century ago in the heart of Siberia. And yet, the Krasnoyarsk Railway Bridge, completed in 1899, remains present in the modern architectural imagination. When Laver Proskuryakov designed the Krasnoyarsk Bridge in the late 1890s, the word architecture was not often applied to infrastructure. Bridges were the domain of engineers, not stylists or theorists. And yet what Proskuryakov achieved was architectural in the highest sense. In 1900, the bridge earned a gold medal at the Paris Exposition Universelle, an international recognition that elevated Russian engineering into the European spotlight. At a time when the Eiffel Tower still loomed as the pinnacle of steel construction, the Krasnoyarsk Bridge stood as a masterful proof to what could be achieved without embellishment. Today, as architectural critics revisit the legacy of the industrial age with new eyes, searching not just for beauty, but for ethical design practices, the bridge is increasingly seen as a forerunner of what we might now call honest architecture. That is, a structure that expresses its purpose and material truth without recourse to spectacle or pretense. One cannot ignore the fact that modern architecture has entered an era of performance. Buildings are not just to be used or even admired. They are to be photographed, circulated, and consumed on screens. And yet, to see its relevance only through the lens of nostalgia would be to misread its place in the present. In fact, the bridge's preserved span, designated a national monument in 2002 and converted into a pedestrian walkway, is part of a growing international movement to reframe infrastructure as civic space. Across the globe, architects and urbanists are repurposing obsolete viaducts and elevated tracks into public parks and cultural corridors. The High Line in New York City, which opened in 2009, the Coulée Verte in Paris, and the Bentway in Toronto are just a few examples. The Krasnoyarsk Bridge's conversion predated many of these and serves as a reminder that adaptive reuse is not a Western invention. Long before hashtags made placemaking trendy, a Siberian city chose to preserve its industrial heritage not in a museum, but underfoot. There's also something to be said about the pedagogical value of the bridge in today's architectural education. In many top architecture schools, students are encouraged to design abstractly, to think in volumes and forms without always anchoring their work in material or structural logic. While this abstraction has its place, the Krasnoyarsk Bridge reminds us that form and function are not enemies. The trusses are shaped precisely because they had to bear a known weight over a known distance. Their beauty is a byproduct of necessity, not indulgence. In this light, the bridge becomes a kind of architectural Rosetta Stone.
A debate has raged for years as to who truly owns historical artifacts, like the Rosetta Stone. Now Egyptians are calling on the British Museum to return part of their cultural heritage.
And it calls attention to a lineage often overlooked in architecture's modern storytelling, the tradition of engineers as designers. Figures like Othmar Ammann, Gustave Eiffel, and Pierre-Luigi Nervi belong in the same pantheon as Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier. The Krasnoyarsk Bridge is part of that tradition, and its continued survival demands its inclusion in architectural histories, not just engineering textbooks. It's also worth noting that in a world increasingly anxious about ecological and climate concerns, the bridge speaks directly to a contemporary anxiety. How do we build with permanence in a time of collapse? Today's green buildings often rely on short-lived technologies, trendy materials, or carbon offsets that mask more than they solve. By contrast, the Krasnoyarsk Bridge represents an old-school sustainability, built from steel and granite, designed to withstand the elements without needing cosmetic updates, and adapted rather than discarded. It shows that architecture doesn't need to be disposable to be modern. Architecturally, The bridge is also a precursor to a particular aesthetic that is now returning to vogue, the industrial sublime. We see it in renovated factories turned into co-working spaces, in brutalist concrete shells repurposed as libraries or art museums, and in the rise of stripped-down steel and glass volumes that prize exposure over enclosure. The Krasnoyarsk Bridge has long been part of that aesthetic, long before it was fashionable. It doesn't hide its rivets or dress up its piers. It is proud of its steel, its spans, its alignment with the riverbanks. And in this honesty lies a kind of rare dignity, one that today's architects, caught between regulation and reinvention, might do well to study. One could also make the argument that the bridge, through its international acclaim in 1900, helped lay the groundwork for modern architectural recognition across national boundaries. At a time when Russia was viewed by many in Western Europe as technologically backward, the bridge served as a proof that Russian engineers could design and execute projects to world-class standards. It cracked open a space for Russian infrastructure to be seen as architecture, not just utility. And in the global architectural discourse today, where we seek to decolonize canons and diversify perspectives, the Krasnoyarsk Bridge stands as an early, under-acknowledged moment of non-Western excellence in a largely Eurocentric narrative. Finally, there is the cultural memory embedded in its steel. Every city has its landmarks, but not all are remembered with affection. The bridge in Krasnoyarsk is different. It is not just a historical footnote for wedding photos, it is something older and deeper. It is a landmark that carries both emotional and architectural weight. It represents survival through revolution, famine, war, and thaw. Its spans have borne not just trains, but history itself. In the end, the relevance of the Krasnoyarsk railway bridge in today's architectural world is not due to scale, spectacle, or novelty. It endures because it insists on a different kind of value, one rooted in permanence, in the fusion of function and form, in a dialogue with the landscape that does not seek to dominate but to belong. In an era of climate anxiety, aesthetic fatigue, and digital simulation, the bridge offers something stubbornly real. Steel that rusts, stone that holds, trusses that do their job with grace. It is a structure that whispers, rather than shouts. But for those who listen, it still has much to teach. Well, do you think the making of the bridge forthright call at the time of its creation? Let us know in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.